Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you here on day two. Suzanne, it's good to
Yeah,
see
welcome.
you as well. We're back together again.
I know we're like the dynamic duo. This is going to be how your week goes, people. Me and Bo every day. So we are super excited for day two. We had so much fun yesterday, and we're excited to see all you guys back. Today's a big day. Today's all about the data, which is the thing everybody wants to talk about. How do you get it? What do you do with it? You know, what does it tell you? So we're here to have answers, right? That's what all the speakers are going to talk about today. What were some takeaways for you yesterday, Bo, and what are you looking forward to today?
Well, I think we just got off to a great start. It was really thought-provoking. You know, if you want to do innovation and you want to really make a difference in diversity innovation, you need to understand what's going on. And today, we're going to dig more into the details. We need to know what is the situation. If we want things to get better, we have to get the data. We have to get people engaged. So I think it's good. I think we can, I felt like everyone was on the same page moving together. So I'm optimistic.
Awesome. Well, why don't you take it away for introductions for today, and then we can get started.
All right. Thanks, Suzanne.
Okay.
So it's my pleasure to introduce our executive director at the Fung Institute for Engineering Leadership, Stephanie Prince, to open up the conference for today. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Bo and Suzanne. I am honored to be here to participate in this conference. On behalf of UC Berkeley and specifically the Fung Institute, we are excited to be a part of this partnership, looking at ways that diversity can impact innovation in so many companies. Yesterday was a phenomenal day and so many great takeaways. At the Fung Institute, we are determined to create inclusive leaders who solve the world's problems through innovation, technology, and collaboration. And what better way to make that happen than being intentional about increasing diversity within our organization so that we can diversify the products and the academic curriculum that we're sharing with our students, so that when they go out into the business world, they not only have the skills that they need to be effective, they know how to tap in to those experiences that they have that begin to contribute to the overall diversity of the organization. And so I had a wonderful day yesterday with the workshops and the speakers. And again, we are excited here at UC Berkeley to take part in a conference that's looking at ways that we can bring diversity into innovation. So Bo and Suzanne, thank you so much for having me this morning. And again, everyone, welcome to the conference and welcome to UC Berkeley.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was awesome. So just as we go into our day today, our speaker is Lisa Cook. She was mentioned numerous times yesterday as being one of the leaders in the space. She's a professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State University. I suggest you all read her bio. I couldn't possibly even list all of the awards and her wonderfulness and do it any kind of justice. But just know that she is a leading pioneer in using data, and in particular patent data, to really trace how discrimination has affected ethnicities in the United States. So I'm turning it over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and Bo, and thank you so much for the invitation and for this important conversation. Let's see, just sharing my slides here. So I'd like to talk about the ideas for the 21st century in terms of broadening participation in invention and innovation. You all have already started this conversation. Again, thank you for allowing me to be part of it. And in terms of what has been said before, the broader world has been slow to embrace conversations on diversity's relationship to innovation and innovation's relationship to diversity. And I was delighted when the folks in Congress, the congressional staffers, emailed me and told me that my work was seminal, and them putting together and introducing the Success Act that was passed in 2018 and the IDEA Act that is being considered now. It has become an amendment that is part of a broader package, but it is being considered right now. And I'm so grateful that they not only used the work, but recognized the work. Let's talk about how fundamental ideas and innovation are to macroeconomics and economic growth. So Paul Romer recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his seminal work on endogenous growth, which just means that the rate of economic growth, the increases in economic growth depend critically on the rate of arrival of ideas. And this isn't something that is static, that is just given. It is something that countries can change and inventors can change. Scientists can change. So I have embraced that. He was an early influence. Of course, he was a professor of mine and in economics at UC Berkeley. And I appreciated his contributing early to my dissertation. So I have been influenced by these ideas for a long time. The upshot is that innovation is a critical part of the economy. We used to think of it, let's say 3 decades ago, as something that was external, that we could not affect, that was given, that all countries would eventually grow at the same rate once they were developed enough, once they were putting the same inputs, using some of the same inputs in similar ways, and that there would be convergence of growth rates. Well, that idea has changed quite a bit. Rather than having this exogenous growth, exogenous growth, it can be endogenous based on the country's willingness to change the conditions for scientists, inventors, innovators to thrive. And individuals can also change that by becoming part of the innovation economy. It is just a very large part of the economy and absolutely seminal to long-run growth. And we're not interested, just to be clear, we're not just interested, macroeconomists, economists are not just interested in long-run growth on its own and for its own sake. We're interested in long-run growth because long-run growth is a source of rising living standards. And this is the social compact that most citizens make, most residents make with their countries, with the leaders of their countries, that each successive generation is better off than the previous generation. So this is the way this is accomplished and how higher living standards are accomplished. So how do we promote ideas in innovation? I think it's urgent to think about and act on for both developed and developing countries. The two sets of economies have different needs, different urgent needs, and some of them are very similar. Climate change can impact, as we've seen recently, can have a devastating effect on both developed and developing economies. We need ideas to address climate change and innovation to address climate change. And we have to think about this urgently, about promoting ideas and innovation. With respect to developed economies, we can expect, let's say, 1 to 3% growth per year. For an advanced industrialized economy, we would expect higher growth, as we've seen in China historically, from developing countries. We, in effect, think of lower growth as being more characteristic of, or slower growth, not lower growth, more characteristic of developed economies rather than developing economies, but both need this. The centrality of ideas to economic growth, I think, was captured well in Obama's State of the Union address, one that he gave when I was working in the White House. Half a century ago, when the Soviets beat us into space and with the launch of a satellite, called Sputnik, we had no idea how we'd beat them to the moon. The science wasn't there yet. NASA didn't even exist. But after investing in better research and education, we didn't just surpass the Soviets, we unleashed a wave of innovation that created new industries and millions of new jobs. This is our generation's Sputnik moment. At stake is whether new jobs and industries take root in this country or somewhere else. The need to generate ideas and innovation, again, is fundamental to macroeconomics and economic growth, as President Obama was speaking to at the time. And if we're thinking about developing economies, not just developed economies, they would like to leapfrog faster, to jump over having to invest in basic research that, say, has already been done in developed economies. They'd like to leapfrog faster and not just use technologies from developed countries, but create them themselves. For example, through bioprospecting and pharmaceutical companies. So if you don't know the story, often or sometimes occasionally, pharmaceutical companies from Western economies show up in developing countries, and they find materials growing, plants growing that could be very useful for different medications, for different chemicals. And the term for that is bioprospecting, without giving, say, royalties to the country, without acknowledging the source of those inputs. So there is an interest that developing economies have in the way ideas and innovation actually arrive in their economies. Developed and developing countries alike have a social compact, as I was saying, with their citizens or the residents of their countries to produce higher living standards. And this is something the US and all other economies of the world have in common. Whether we're talking about Russia, or we're talking about Venezuela or the US, this is something that successive generations think about, that they would be better off than previous generations. Going back to the question of how we promote ideas and innovation, I will address this by drawing on my experience in economics and my research on innovation. And I have come up with two sets of policy prescriptions. One is positive prescriptions. For example, asking the question, how do we increase participation to increase the arrival rate of ideas? And secondly, negative prescriptions, how can we allow ideas to flow freely, free from barriers that have been erected over time? You might have in your mind the dichotomy between positive freedom and negative freedom, and this is what I'm drawing on. One way to increase participation, to increase the arrival rate of ideas, is to increase the pipeline. That's just one way. It's not the way, it's just one way. This includes augmenting undergraduate research experiences and make sure those are widely shared, widely known about, that students who are shown to be capable are invited to participate in those research experiences, and not just the students you know, or the students who have been selected along some other dimension, but there's broad participation in those research experiences. And often it's not those who have already accomplished a certain amount in that particular field, but the goal is to interest people who have not been exposed, students who have not been exposed to a certain way of thinking, a certain subject, to these ideas, and to STEM, for example, STEM fields, for example. So I think undergraduate research experiences are absolutely critical in this process. I used to be director of the AEA, the American Economic Association Summer Program. And this is something that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation. Economics is considered a STEM field. So I have quite a bit of experience like that. And there should be more AEA summer programs, more programs like that. Intensive summer programs or just intensive programs to introduce students to the material and to prepare them to do PhDs in STEM fields like economics. I think another positive prescription to augment the pipeline would be to grant degrees like associate's degrees along the way for a BA to encourage college students and diminish their debt load. So this would be analogous to having received a master's degree along the way, receiving a PhD. It's not an add-on, something that just happens at the end of your completing a certain number of courses, for example. So I think we can take that example and move it to bachelor's degrees to encourage students who might feel discouraged at the end of 2 years and who could use an associate's degree to already start participating in the fields they've chosen. I think early exposure would also be a positive prescription. For example, Spark Lab at the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the Smithsonian is a great laboratory. It exposes students, especially elementary school students, to invention, and not just invention, but to innovation. They walk into Spark Lab and they have the ingredients for an invention, and then they invent something, and they walk out of the Lemelson Center, out of the Spark Lab, with an invention. I can't tell you how empowering that actually is. Students think of themselves as not just the recipients of technology, but also the creators of innovation, the creators of invention, and in the process of inventing, they learn how to commercialize their invention. How do they make it useful for others? How do they market it to others? So I think creating and replicating what Spark Lab does is absolutely critical. Recently on Twitter, I saw that someone mentioned that Black and brown children are taught obedience and white children are taught to be curious. And that's something that I would like to militate against in terms of children seeing themselves being empowered by math, by the STEM fields, by problem solving, and not just seeing themselves as consumers. That's how you increase participation. That's how you broaden participation. So I think this is, Spark Lab is just one example of how to do that. I think all children's ideas should be taken seriously. And again, this is one way to do that. Raj Chetty and co-authors have shown that early exposure to invention is associated with better long-run outcomes for individuals, more invention, higher incomes, and higher educational attainment, for example. So this is, I think, something that that we are consistent about. There's further empirical evidence of what I am claiming. And recently, I have a set of papers that looks at the pipeline and early interventions. This was written in conjunction with the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And there's a focus on mentoring, and mentoring is absolutely important, an important part of the pipeline. And I think there could be a lot more of that, especially, again, for those who have not been exposed to invention, innovation, and the fields that often lead to invention and innovation. For economics, this means obtaining broader knowledge besides economics and math, although those are critical. And if we have time, I'll tell you the story of my paper that I talked about at length during a tweet storm once, if we have time. But it is absolutely critical that we include different life experiences in our research endeavors and our scientific endeavors, because it's not just diversity of thought that is needed, it is the diversity of lived experiences, because they are so incredibly different and they change our problem solving analyses and our ability to do those analyses broadly and thoughtfully. It was rare before I wrote my seminal paper that's been much discussed in the Journal of Economic Growth about the impact of violence on not just innovation, but on economic activity that is the outcome of innovation. That is one of the byproducts of innovation. This graph is the seminal graph in that paper, and what it shows is Black patents that are in red and white patents, or patents that are obtained by white inventors in blue. And the proper axis to read the red line is the right-hand side axis, and these are patents per million. And the proper axis to read the blue line is the left-hand side axis. Now, what I want to show as a macroeconomist is the direction of these movements, not the level. I'm more interested in the direction. And while they probably weren't achieving convergence, they were at least moving in the same direction. And that's what we would expect for all inventors who are mobile, who understand how to capitalize on ideas, how to receive patents for their ideas. So what struck me about this graph, as I think it might strike you, is the dramatic change for African Americans, number one, but also the change that doesn't take place for white inventors, i.e., there's a dramatic negative shock to African Americans, and it never recovers. And I've done a calculation of patents per million using 2010 data, and they still haven't recovered with respect to patents per capita. 1899 is still the peak year for patents per capita for African Americans. That suggests that this is ripe for attempting to broaden participation, which is why I welcome this conversation today. Negative prescriptions. So how can we allow ideas to flow freely, free from barriers that have been erected over time? One prescription has become more and more salient. I am on Twitter a lot, have conversations about technology, invention, and innovation a lot on Twitter. And what I have noticed is that a lot of people have been commenting on, especially in African Americans in the tech field, Black people in the tech field have been commenting on their experiences. And this used to be a very small part of my papers when I was talking about prescriptions, or small part of my prescriptions addressing workplace climate. This has become more urgent as I learned that a number of the stories that I heard in the process of my interviewing people for my research in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, those weren't one-off. They weren't idiosyncratic. They were much more endemic and pervasive. And there are ways that sexual harassment, racial harassment, keep people from participating in the arrival rate of ideas, increasing the arrival rate of ideas. So it's not just at tech firms. I want to be clear. It's in the entire innovation economy at every single stage. So at the stage of education, the beginning stages, the stage of practicing in, say, laboratories and corporate labs and government labs. And then certainly at the commercialization part of the innovation economy, taking inventions to create innovation, to commercialize them and create innovation. This is where there is a lot less participation than you see, say, at the beginning of the process in STEM education, for example. And why is this really important? Well, this is where IPOs happen, for example. And if you look at the Forbes 10 richest people today, you can see that there may or may not be a woman among them, depending. I didn't check today, but there may or may not be. But there certainly is not a person of African descent who is in the top 10. Most of them, again, depending on when you check this, because this could change daily since wealth changes daily. 7 of 10 typically are in the innovation economy, made their money through the innovation economy. So this is very important if we are ever talking about income and wealth inequality. And what we know is that only 5% of founders receiving VC funding are women. Women receive 5% of the funding, and 1% are African American, and roughly 2.2% are Black women. So this is a really urgent problem. Now, of course, that comes with the caveat that most businesses don't receive VC funding. Most founders don't receive VC funding. But given that they actually do receive funding, that's an abysmally small share. So we can work on workplace climate over time. So I think that's the biggest prescription, and this is one that's becoming more animated through the empirical evidence and stories, anecdotes that are being shared.
Professor Cook, we have a question.
Sure.
They would like to get some advice from you on how to catch the interest of local and state governments in diversity and innovation. And anything, again, how do you have this conversation with them, and then how do you begin to craft something that's meaningful?
I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to consult the US PTO, the Patent Office's data with respect to patenting by state. We certainly have an accounting of how states are doing. We have less information, but this can certainly be derived by the county level, for example. We can get local governments interested with similar data. And the question can be posed: what is, say, the county, or what are the counties doing that make up the research triangle that other counties aren't doing to support invention and innovation? I think the question has to be posed, and it's not always a race to the bottom. It's summer camps focused on invention and innovation. That doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Attracting people of diverse backgrounds to a particular place, it does not have to be a zero-sum game. So I think they can be intimately involved. Chambers of Commerce are very interested in this. Regional development authorities are very interested in augmenting innovation in their region. So I think you'll have a willing audience once you present the empirical evidence. Is there another question? I'll take another question if you'd like, before I get back to the slides.
That's all we got right now, but I'll let you know if we get another one. Oh, they're great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sounds good. In terms of removing unnecessary barriers, there's one more issue I'd like to discuss, and it has to do with the problem of the proliferation of pre-doctoral programs. And I think for non-econ fields, this is probably just more generally about pre-doctoral programs. So let me say a bit about that. So sometimes these can actually raise the specter of impeding racial, ethnic, and class diversity. How might that happen? Institutions and engineering programs may not think about the broader impact of how they're setting up the programs. You know, who gets to know about them? How are students recruited into those programs? Now, I've already said that for the pipeline, we should think about increasing undergraduate research opportunities. On the flip side, if there are ones created that have a hidden curriculum, for example, and are part of an arms race, an academic arms race for resources and publications by assistant professors who are trying to get tenure, and one intentional or unintentional outcome could be unpaid or underpaid labor for these pre-docs. This is something that should really be thought about carefully in a more global sense, not just for a particular institution, but in a global sense. What are those pre-doctoral programs doing? Are they really training students, or are they using them as unpaid or underpaid labor? The other outcome that I think is very serious, particularly for women, is that the pre-doctoral programs can lengthen the time it takes for students to obtain degrees and to actually start working in their professions, and as researchers, as inventors. And that's not good for the individuals, it's not good for the firms, and it's not good for the economy. So they're postponing decisions that will affect their careers, that will affect their families, and will affect the economy. So I think that there has to be more thought given to how these programs are set up. And there are lots of them for STEM fields, and an increasing number for economics. And of course, there should be more opportunities, especially for women, underrepresented minorities who are women, for professional development. There seems to be a fairly consistent divide with respect to professional opportunities and ways to get into parts of the innovation economy that women, underrepresented minorities, and underrepresented minorities who are women have access to. So there's lots to do. So what's at stake? I've said a lot about positive prescriptions and negative prescriptions, but what's at stake? Here's what's at stake. My co-author Yan Yang and I have actually calculated this. GDP per capita would be 0.6% to 4.4% higher if more women and African Americans participated in the innovation economy, especially at the beginning. So this is significant. This isn't trivial. So we have to think about that in an urgent sense. And this is just not abstract. It's not sitting out there as a calculation. It is it's real money, and it's a real increase. It represents a real increase in living standards. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any more questions that you might have.
Great. Yeah, so we want to open it up to questions. If anybody has anything you want to chat about, if you could raise your hand. Sam, you want to go ahead? Sam, can you unmute yourself? Nope. Okay. Anybody? Okay.
Well, Suzanne, I'd like to ask a question. I did a lot of research to interview people who were in the innovation economy for the research that I've discussed in other research. So what to them has worked? That's what I'd like to know. I've put forward these policy prescriptions in a number of papers. I want to know what they believe has worked in the past.
Okay, so it turns out, everyone, that because we're in a webinar, I'll need you to write it in the chat, and then we'll kind of go from that way. So let's see, from Jill, are there best practices for training on ramps to internships for both the folks running programs and for the participants themselves?
I haven't seen any in one particular place, but I would say with respect to the summer program that I ran, the program in economics, the American Economic Association summer program, it was a best practice to make sure that every way possible was used to democratize access to the program. So we implemented for the first time in the history of the program, very intensive and broad and sophisticated social media outreach program. We recruited on campuses, just like businesses would do for this talent. So we were very dogged in trying to make sure that the same information wasn't going to the same people, and that we reached more community colleges, that we reached universities that didn't typically participate. So that was, I think that was fundamental, and that was key. It was also key to have professors and graduate students from all over the country participating in the summer program along with the students. That provided more innovation, more opportunities for mentoring for the students. So I think that was critical.
So we have another question that's, could you talk a little bit about your work with the USPTO and the guidance you provided them on how to make meaningful change?
So I am currently an Edison Fellow at the USPTO. So this is something that is ongoing. I was invited there to help think about how to identify people in racial and ethnic minorities, among racial and ethnic minorities, to just figure out who's participating in invention and innovation. And I think that's critical, because if you don't know who's participating, you don't know how to increase that participation. You may not know that you need to increase participation, much less how. So this is, I think it's absolutely critical that people are counted and counted correctly, and that we open up invention and innovation to as many people as possible. So that's the work that I'm doing.
Awesome. They're coming in kind of quick and fast here. So,
okay.
So we have a lot of folks on the line who are patent professionals, and how can they work to increase diversity and innovation and patent ownership? I mean, what are some thoughts you have for them?
I think, just as a practical matter, I don't mean to keep promoting something like Spark Lab, but if they could, I think this is the implementation of the empirical work, say, that I've done, or that Raj Shetty and co-authors have done. This is already there. This is a structure that's already there. What we don't see, when I was visiting at the Lemelson Center, I found that the elementary school kids coming to the Lemelson Center were to Spark Lab were largely homogeneous. And I think that if we're talking about broadening participation, we've got to make sure that every part of every state is represented, that school children from every single district and every single school have the opportunity to do this. That takes resources. So this could be something that patent professionals could suggest funding school trips to something like Spark Lab, or Spark Lab is licensing Spark Labs all over the country. Try to get a Spark Lab in your area, in your region. I think that's the way patent professionals can try to affect the pipeline. And of course, they can try to make sure that workplace climate is something that is paid attention to in various firms and in various workplaces. That's how one could really be helpful, I think.
So I think really kind of distilling that down for a little bit, it's trying to meet those folks in their communities in ways that are accessible for them, right? I mean, we can't assume that they're all going to go to their high-tech workplace and have access to all of the tools that everyone else might have. So isn't it really a way to meet them wherever they are?
Well, yes, meeting them where they are can, I mean, we have to be very specific about that, but I'm also saying, with respect to the Sparklight example, I'm saying, go to those communities where the students are and take them to Spark Lab. I think it is a special experience in the sense that you're not in the same place you typically are. You can think outside the box in this particular place. They have the formula down. They have this experience down. So in that sense, for Spark Lab, you meet them where they are, but you take them to a place where they're not. Yeah. And that's the entire crux of the experience. But in terms of, say, recruiting students, or recruiting professionals to join firms, to get into IP programs and to law programs, one should go where, say, Black people are doing a lot of innovation, say Atlanta, not looking for them just in Silicon Valley, but looking for them in places like Atlanta where there's a lot of innovation happening. Okay.
We also have some questions about how important is it to find ways to instill confidence for minority inventors, and any thoughts you have on that?
I think it's huge. And I think if I've been an observer of the ecosystem in Atlanta, and I think it is, I think it's really, and in Oakland, for example, I think it is, it's critical. Okay. And I think mentoring programs help with instilling that confidence. And I see that people reach out and create informal mentors or formal mentors for specific projects, for specific parts of the innovation process. So it's something that may take work, but I think instilling confidence is critical for so many different parts of the innovation economy. As I was saying, instilling confidence in kids that they can create and not just be consumers, that they are empowered to create, their ideas can be taken seriously. I think this is critical. That kind of confidence is seminal and can take them through a career as an inventor.
Agreed. I'm going to shift topics slightly. Many companies, what we're doing today is we're talking about how companies can get their data, and in particular, using first names to assign gender. And we know you've been doing some work on an algorithm that identifies Black inventors. Can you talk a little bit about that and give us a preview of what that might look like?
Sure. So let me say first that I reject out of hand that gender is easy to do and race is not as easy to do. In certain cultures, names are ascribed to both men and women. So in certain cultures, this can be very difficult too, but we've found ways to address that issue. We can do the same for race and ethnicity. So anytime you see data being collected on gender, you should ask whether data are being collected on race and ethnicity. I think that this has to do a lot with either seeing it as a difficult problem or not wanting to wade into, political spaces that exist beyond us researchers. So I want to make that crystal clear that we don't need to think of ourselves as engaging in political activity. We're asking simple questions like who's participating in research, who's participating in invention and innovation. With respect to creating the algorithms, it is absolutely fundamental to understand the historical sources that are being used. And the census is a historical source. So we want to be clear about that. We are training algorithms on data sets that have historical flaws. And we need to be very, very careful in how we are training these algorithms based on well-known features, for example, of the census. My co-author and I couldn't find our grandfathers in the census the first time we looked, right? We know they existed, right? So I'm just saying that when economists are being hired wholesale by tech firms, for example, they're some of the largest employers of economists these days. We have to take into account something they aren't used to taking into account because they may be considered minor mistakes in economics, but they have real world outcomes when we're developing these algorithms outside of economics.
So do you think is that something that's ready today, or is it still being refined, or how do you see that being
at the USPTO?
Well, just I don't know, are you piloting it at the USPTO, or are you going to release it yourself, the algorithm?
I certainly would like to. I'm both working on it with a research team personally, just as a researcher, and I'm working with the USPTO and trying to develop something.
Okay, well,
so I'm doing both. So I hope certainly I would hope that the USPTO would release theirs, but I hope also that just like Genderize, program that has been used to identify gender, I hope that ones related to race and ethnicity will be released in the same way, user-developed ones.
Yeah, so again, I think we would be happy to help promote that once it's ready to go be released, because again, we're able to help companies get their gender data, and that is only the beginning, right? Clearly, there are a lot of underrepresented groups that they need to address. So the more and better data we can give them or help them to get, the better off it will be.
Right.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of the questions are sort of building on the Spark Labs piece, which is, not surprisingly, it's a big ask. It's a big ask of law firms or of other firms to help support Spark Labs. So what do you think the kind of data that could be used to help sell this idea? There seems to be a general set of questions around that. And is it really that they produce more innovation for underrepresented inventors, or are they targeting different communities perhaps, or? Yeah.
Well, I think the problem is that, Spark Lab can only do so much. It can create the experience. Now, if you can, maybe the ask would be to replicate that experience in another way. But what I'm saying is I wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel that way. So licensing Spark Lab in one's own community is something that could be done. And that's just reaching out to the Smithsonian, to the Lemelson Center. And, they have innovation in a box, right? So they can just
Yeah,
roll
exactly.
this out. So I'm trying to think about the minimum cost exercise that can be scaled up or scaled around the country. Make sure that, or if you don't want to create one in your own universe, in your own neighborhood, figure out a way to take the school children on an excursion to Spark Lab in DC or to the nearest one. There's several museums around the country that have licensed Spark Lab. So I don't think that that's a huge ask, but if they're looking for long-term impact, I think trying to get one in their neighborhoods would be, and when I say their neighborhoods, their surrounding area, that would be, I think, beneficial.
Okay. I'm going to read you kind of a long question, so just bear with me for a second.
Sure.
Should we be thinking about inequality not by specific group, but statistically based on groups underrepresented based on their population? For example, the census once asked people their race and the general response was mixed. So trying to categorize people might not be constructive with a specific definition. Instead, just use statistical models, i.e. could be African Americans in rural locations. So so I guess it's how do we go from specific group to statistics based on population?
Well, I actually reject the notion that this is a better way to proceed. One thing that my co-authors and I have shown is that our way of hand collecting data has been much better, has performed much better than using statistical models to identify people. And that's because of what I just said about the census, that it has these well-known features that undercount African Americans, for example. I'll say it again. My co-author and I could not find our grandfathers in the census data when we first started looking. So I'm just saying that we might want to try to augment statistical models with hand-collected data with many more checks. Those cannot be used alone, and they cannot be used just because the census exists. Just because we have the data doesn't mean you have a guide to how the data are to be used, or that you're cognizant of the flaws and that you minimize those flaws. There's a lot of work to be done in that regard.
Okay. So what do you think we haven't asked that coming back that you want to, highlight for everyone here? Again, predominantly corporate folks on the line or folks from law firms.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for everything that you're doing in this regard. A lot of times when I am talking to my corporate partners and friends, they think of these issues as insurmountable. They are not. My family has been working on this over the generations, and I've seen progress. And I know that progress can be made, and it can be made sustainably. One of my relatives was a seminal developer of cortisone, right? And his house was firebombed twice. He was the first African American to head a corporate lab, and this was Glidden Labs. This is Percy Julian. And I would say that just because we've seen something in our past doesn't mean that that is our present course and that that is our future course. And the best practices that I've been talking about have some empirical grounding. Certainly look at the work of Raj Chetty on inventors and exposure to inventors if you need more empirical evidence. And I think that we have to break it down into these bits. I mean, I talk a lot about Spark Lab because I am on the advisory board of the Lemelson Center, but I've been through the lab myself. And I was thinking, how empowering would it have been for me to be a kid thinking about an invention that I walked out of a museum with, and I showed to all of my neighbors, showed to all of my friends, showed to my family, showed to my siblings. I mean, some of this work is just the demonstration effect. If you can support the demonstration effect, meeting people where they are, or
Right.
bringing them where they are not. I think you can have a huge impact.
Okay, I'm going to close it out with one more question. It's
Mhm.
from a data scientist, so we keep coming back to that.
Mhm,
Today is the data day.
Right.
So how did you obtain data on diversity and inventors? Using something like a name algorithm on African-American inventors seems to have low accuracy. How do we solve this data gap just going forward?
Well, I have an entire paper about Black names and how I identified them, for example. I also was extremely conservative. So what you see, the data that you see on patents is certainly an undercount, is very conservative. The gap is probably even larger, but I was very conservative in the way that I constructed this for the period 1870 to 1940. Yes, the data will be flawed, but the data on gender will be flawed.
Right.
So we have to get comfortable with the types of flaws and how we can minimize them. We have to work to minimize them. So we shouldn't just throw up our hands as data scientists, as economists, as statisticians, and say we can't do it. But I see that often with respect to race and ethnicity, and not with respect to gender. There are entire papers on identifying Chinese names. And this is one of those languages where men and women can have the same name. And there are entire papers on this now. So I'm saying this is coming, and it's coming thick and fast. So we shouldn't give up and assume that this is just difficult. It's
Right.
because we haven't paid attention to it. And now there's research that can help us in identifying these names.
And would having companies work with you be beneficial to get this sort of out faster? Is that something that would be useful, or how can we get companies are really interested in this topic and in this area? So how could we put that together to help you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I didn't say that before, but I would be happy to talk to firms about this and how this might be done, how this effort might be undertaken.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I think we'll have to
Be
come
in
back
touch.
on that. Exactly.
Be in touch.
That's right. We'll chat. Last one. Can you tell us the name of the paper? We have someone asking for the name of your paper identifying people of African American descent.
There's a paper in historical methods. So I discuss. So wait a minute. No, that's not
We
the
just
paper.
need the name of it so they can search.
No, but that's what I'm saying. I have a number of papers that allude to this process. There are, look at the couple of papers that John Parman, Trevon Logan, and I have written on Black names.
Okay.
That's a start.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I think we have to wrap this up. I want to say thank you, Lisa. This has been super helpful and informative. And again, you'll be hearing from us because we want to keep working with you to push this forward. So thank you. Thank you for the great talk, and thank you, everyone. I'd ask for you guys to go back to your Whova app and take a few minutes to transfer over to your next session. You'll have to choose between the Learn or the Act session. So we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Okay, bye.